arguments they previously made about Saddam Hussein. Iran is routinely portrayed as actively seeking to get nuclear weapons, even though U.S. intelligence services believe it has no active weapons program and is probably seeking only a latent or breakout capability. Hawks describe Iran's leaders as unstable or irrational, which is precisely how they used to talk about Saddam Hussein. They warned that a nuclear Iran would be able to blackmail its neighbors, dominate the Persian Gulf, or give nuclear weapons to terrorists. They claimed that failure to stop Iran would damage American credibility, trigger an arms race in the region, and lead our other Middle East allies to abandon us. And just as the neocons argued an attack on Iraq would be easy and pay for itself, advocates of war downplay the costs and risks and argue it will hasten the end of the clerical regime. What about the mainstream groups in the lobby? Organizations like AIPAC have generally refrained from making overt calls for war, but they've worked overtime to reinforce a hawkish line. AIPAC played a key role in drafting the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions, Divestment, and Accountability Act of 2010, which broadens American sanctions against Iran and authorizes punishing foreign companies that aid Iran's petroleum sector. The bill was also endorsed by the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, the Anti-Defamation League, and by the progressive lobby J Street. It was opposed by leading business groups and by Americans for Peace Now. And by the way, that legislation passed the House by a vote of 408 to 8 and by the Senate 99 to 0. AIPAC also helped draft a congressional resolution declaring it a vital national interest of the United States to prevent the Islamic Republic from acquiring a nuclear weapons capability, and notice that meaning just the capacity to build one, and affirming that Congress opposes any policy that would rely on containment as an option in response to the Iranian nuclear threat. A 2012 AIPAC policy brief warned, quote, "The United States must quicken the pace and scope of sanctions while bolstering the credibility of its option to use force. The United States cannot rely on a policy that seeks to contain a nuclear Iran." And not to be outdone, American Jewish Committee head David Harris wrote in the New York Times in March, quote, "The United States and many other like-minded nations have no choice but to get tough. Otherwise, we face the game-changing prospect of an Iran capable of building a nuclear bomb." And notice, he's not talking about Iran with an actual weapon. He's saying we cannot tolerate an Iran that could, in theory, build one. As in 2002, therefore, key individuals and organizations in the lobby are in the forefront of those pushing for a hardline approach, and in some cases openly favoring the use of force. Equally important, it is hard to find any other powerful constituency favoring a similar course. In fact, there's considerable opposition to using force throughout the U.S. government. For example, the U.S. military is decidedly skeptical, with former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates warning, "If you think war with Iraq was hard, an attack on Iran would, in my position, be a catastrophe." Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Martin Dempsey, told CNN host Fareed Zakaria in February of this year, "An attack on Iran would not be prudent." Neither the Department of State nor the CIA favor military action. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton saying last month that war is not in anyone's interest, and Director of National Intelligence James Clapper reaffirming the CIA's earlier judgment with a high level of confidence that Iran has not made a decision as of this point to restart its nuclear weapons program. So AIPAC President David Victor was largely correct when he told members in 2009, quote, "We are the only constituency in America making this anti-Iranian case." Or as the New York Times reported earlier this year, among those advocating a more aggressive approach toward Iran are groups like the Emergency Committee for Israel and AIPAC, the so-called neocons from the Bush administration, and pro-Israel evangelicals like Gary Bauer. One should add every prominent GOP presidential candidate except Ron Paul. And again, let's not overlook the Christian Zionists like John Hagee, who declared way back in 2006 that the United States must join Israel in a preemptive military strike against Iran in order to fulfill God's plan for both Israel and the West. In short, it is not hard to find worrisome parallels between the current debate on Iran and the earlier campaign for war with Iraq. Fortunately, there are also some critical differences. One obvious difference is that no one is seriously proposing invading or occupying Iran. Instead, the debate has been whether to conduct airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. The obvious weakness of that option is that it can only delay the program, not eliminate it once and for all. A second difference is that groups in the lobby are more divided on this issue than they were over the invasion of Iraq. Unlike 2002, a few voices in the pro-Israel community reject the use of force today and call for diplomacy instead. For example, both J Street and Americans for Peace Now opposed the AIPAC-sponsored resolution that rejected any policy of containment. Former U.S. official Dennis Ross, who's now a fellow at the Washington Institute and was an open supporter of war with Iraq in 2002, has been stressing the need for diplomacy in recent weeks. Other prominent pro-Israel commentators, such as Leonard Fine or Leslie Gelb, have been openly critical of the renewed emphasis on military threats as well. Third, Israel's national security establishment is far from unified about the need to strike Iran. Netanyahu has continued to hype the threat, but prominent members of Israel's defense and intelligence establishment have openly questioned whether Iran is an existential threat and warned that an Israeli strike would be foolish. The former head of the Mossad, Meir Dagan, called an Israeli airstrike the stupidest thing he had ever heard of. The current chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces, General Benny Gantz, told Haaretz that "I think the Iranian leadership is composed of very rational people," adding that he did not think Supreme Leader Khamenei even wanted to go the extra mile to get nuclear weapons. The former head of Shin Bet, Yuval Diskin, warned that Israeli airstrikes could result, quote, in a dramatic acceleration of Iran's nuclear program. And then former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert told an audience here in the United States that Netanyahu's bellicose posture was jeopardizing international support, and he again emphasized the need for diplomacy. Last, but by no means least, the Obama administration seems to recognize that war with Iran is neither necessary nor wise. Its position stands in sharp contrast to Bush and Cheney, who drank the neocons' Kool-Aid after 9/11 and led a sophisticated public relations campaign to convince the American people to support an unprovoked and illegal war. Pressure from the lobby and election year politics have forced President Obama to walk a rather fine line, reaffirming support for Israel while downplaying the need to use force, though I think it's clear he believes that war would be foolish. Now, both Obama and Netanyahu's critics in Israel are right, and we should be thankful that the constellation of political forces has lined up differently today than it did before the war in Iraq. Let me briefly explain why war with Iran would be a blunder of enormous proportions. For starters, Iran is not an existential threat to anyone. Its defense spending is about $10 billion a year, less than 2% of what the United States spends. It has no significant power projection capabilities. It also has no powerful allies. Second, although it would be better if Iran did not develop nuclear weapons, achieving the capacity to make a few bombs won't transform the region or turn Iran into a regional superpower. Several of Iran's neighbors already have arsenals of their own, and Iran could not use its weapons without facing devastating retaliation. Iran could not blackmail or coerce anyone for the same reasons that the Soviet Union couldn't blackmail other countries when it had thousands of nuclear weapons and sophisticated long-range missiles. Nor are Iranians likely to give any weapons that they have struggled for decades to acquire to some terrorist group, because of course they would be giving up all control over them. Contrary to what alarmists in the lobby might tell you, there's no evidence that Iran's leaders don't fully understand these basic realities. Third, Tehran has not yet decided to build a weapon, and there are good reasons why it might prefer not to. But if Israel or the United States attacks, that is bound to convince Iran's leaders that they have no choice but to acquire a real deterrent in the form of their own nuclear arsenal. Ironically, attacking Iran, or even continually threatening it with regime change, may be the best way to push Iran across the nuclear threshold. Fourth, Our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan ought to teach us that war is unpredictable and messy, and the costs can be enormous and victory elusive. A war would drive up oil prices, threaten a global economic recovery that is still on life support. Iran would surely seek to retaliate in various ways. Groups like Hezbollah might join in by firing rockets at Israel itself. And even a successful airstrike could not stop Iran from digging out and redoubling its efforts, just as Saddam Hussein did after Israel bombed the Osirak reactor in 1981. Fifth, an Israeli or U.S. attack would rally Persian nationalism and give the clerical regime a new lease on life. Iran's current government is not wildly popular. Many younger Iranians would like closer and more open ties with the West. But if Israel or the United States attacks, an Iranian-American détente will be set back for years. Lastly, the whole debate about Iran has been a giant distraction from other key regional issues, which may be precisely what Netanyahu and AIPAC want. Obama's initial efforts to encourage a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians has been stymied ever since 2009. Many responsible observers in Israel, the Arab world, and the United States now worry that a two-state solution is becoming impossible, or will be very soon. This situation is a looming threat for Israel, a continual headache for the United States, and of course a disaster for the Palestinians. For if two states are not achieved, the only alternatives are one-state democracy, ethnic cleansing to remove all Palestinians from Greater Israel, or some form of permanent apartheid. Those last two alternatives are obviously contrary to key American values, and in my view, all three options would consign these two peoples to another generation of bitter strife. This is not simply an abstract matter of grand strategy or realpolitik. It is also a matter of genuine human suffering, as Palestinians face the denial of basic rights, the steady encroachment of Israeli settlers, repeated home demolitions and expulsions, the imprisonment of thousands of family members, the daily degradation of checkpoints that stifle commerce and keep families apart, inadequate access to water, attacks by settler gangs that have increased by over 200% in the past 2 years, and countless other humiliations, large and small. Not to mention actual killings, including nearly 5,000 in the Second Intifada, nearly 1,400 in Operation Cast Lead, and 258 since then. Israelis have also died tragic deaths during this period, but in far smaller numbers. None of this is in America's strategic interest, especially given the winds of change that are now blowing through the Arab world. No matter how the Arab Spring ultimately turns out, future Arab governments will be more responsive to public sentiment than autocrats like Hosni Mubarak were. And because the Palestinian issue continues to resonate among Arab populations, the continued denial of Palestinian rights will force the United States to pay an increasingly high price for its special relationship, and especially if the hopeful vision of two states for two peoples is replaced by permanent apartheid. This is not to say that Iran can be ignored, but it should be obvious what the proper course of action is. Having gotten Iran back to the bargaining table, the United States should take the threat of regime change off the table so that Iran has less incentive to weaponize. We should acknowledge that Iran is entitled to enrich uranium in accordance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, provided it agrees to full inspections under the IAEA and implements the so-called additional protocol. Washington and the other member